Hi everyone, today we're going to be building Time for Machine's Glorious Cabrio 2. Now this is a high-end sheet metal model, and as you can see, it comes with a coil and a fabric to wipe off the grease that's going to be on the sheet metal when you're using your fingers. So it comes with an instructional manual that's all graphics, and the sheet metals are actually separated by this folder that it comes with, and the sheet metal itself is actually thicker than the other models, and this is very similar to the other build that I've made because it's the same company, Time for Machine, and this is a really great metal model, and it's a very high quality, and we'll get started. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the tools. This is the list of the tools that I've been using, and I actually use a couple other different types of pliers, and I actually keep a closet of pliers just because you never know what shape you might need for what use. So it's always good to have as many pliers as you have, just for that 1 or 2 instances where you might need something special. I almost want to call this build video a series of unfortunate events, and the reason why is because this very first part, I actually created the part inside out, and as you can see, because of that, there's going to be a series of unfortunate mistakes that happens, and I realized it later on in the build where I have to go back and actually undo a lot of the parts that I've already attached to the body, just so that I can reverse the very first step. And it kind of shows when sometimes you're doing something and your first step is off, kind of the rest of the build just feels off. And I've had a couple other mistakes during this build where I would just totally look at the manual incorrectly, and I'll actually build the part inside out, or I would actually forego one of the parts completely, and I realized that later on, and luckily it wasn't too hard of a part to fit it back into the body. It was actually one of the gears that I didn't realize I didn't build, and so when I started testing it out, the part was not moving properly, and then I realized there's no gear in the middle connected to other gears. And so one thing I do a lot, and I do often, is like throughout the steps I would actually test the parts by moving it around, and you're going to see me do that a lot where I'm going to be jiggling things, or I'm going to be moving or rotating to see if the gears are moving in place. Is it affecting the other gears? Is it getting caught? Because it's actually easier to figure out your mistakes and then try to kind of fix it along the way, and the earlier you fix it, the better it is. So this is actually later on in the build. I think I was about maybe 3/4 of the way done with the build when I realized that the body was wrong, and the reason why I noticed that is that you'll see later on, I actually do test out once I put in the wheel axis. I realized that the wheel and the main axle were not actually rotating with each other, and then I realized that it was because of the holder for the axle on this body is on the right side, and it actually should be on the left side, so that the main axle should be a parallel line to the body of the car, and mine was actually at a diagonal. And for that reason, I had to undo everything that I've done up to the point that you'll see later on, and actually have to rebuild that part and put it back in. And so this part right here, the part that you see for the cockpit, is actually the wrong one, but just assume that it is corrected because I'm showing you how to correct it early on. So just assume that the rest of the video is corrected for that, and we're just going to assume that the parts are correct and it's been built correctly, and we're just going to continue on with the video. One thing I love about the Time for Machine models is that since the sheet metals are a lot thicker, it is very forgiving. And as I mentioned earlier, with the cockpit, if this was a different sheet metal series like Metal Earth, since the sheet metals are actually thinner, what ends up happening is if you bend it one way and then bend it 180 degrees the other way, then a lot of times that part will snap. And in this case, I made a few areas where I made the mistake of actually building the part inside out, and I was able to reverse it, and the sheet metal was able to handle it, and nothing snapped, and it did not look like it was dented or misplaced or anything. It was still a really clean build, so I'm actually happy with how forgiving the sheet metal is. Now with all the axles that you'll be building on this build, the one thing to note is that all of these are usually doubled up. So you have two of the identical pieces that you're gonna double up, and there are slots along the middle of the axle, like about 2 slots usually, where you put in a tab through it. And so make sure that you're aware of that, and make sure that those slots are aligned, and then you can put in the tab and twist it in. And then for the gear part that you're adding on, since you have to spread it out, I'm actually using the X-Acto knife to be able to get in between the two tabs and then bend it by using kind of leverage, and then finishing it off with a plier to make sure that it is fastened completely. With this build, a lot of times when you're adding in an axle or the wheel, you'll be actually bending the tab, or actually the holder, out of the way with a plier, and then once you put the axle in, you'll actually bend the piece back in, and that's how you keep the axle in place. But it actually allows the axle some movement, freedom of movement, that it can still rotate in its place. So as you can see here, my axle is actually slightly diagonal, while this one should actually be straight, and it's all due to that body part of the actual cockpit that was actually inside out. So this is where you would notice a mistake if you did this incorrectly, and unfortunately I didn't catch on until later on in the build. Now we're going to be attaching the trunk to the frame, and it is kind of hard to line all the tabs to fit into the hole because they're at multiple different angles. So my suggestion is actually to start on one side and start securing one tab, and then moving on to the next tab on the same side of the frame. And then once you finish off one side, you can go back and align the other side, and then close off the frame. It is a little bit difficult to align, so just be ready to be bending the pieces as you need to. You might not get the exact angle the first try, so you're just gonna have to keep bending and warping until you kind of make the shape the right area. I do want to talk about the wheels, and I've stated this on other models for wheels, and a lot of times you're going to have two different types of wheels, one with a center with a circular hole, another one with a slot. And the slot and the hole are two different types of wheels. Usually the ones with the circular hole will actually be the front wheels, because those are actually not connected to the wind-up, while the slots are actually on the axle that will actually be wound up with the gear. So when you're working on the rear wheels, which I am working on right now, you're sometimes going to have the slots, and you want to make sure that the slots are aligned properly, because if you're just following the tabs on the side of the wheels and aligning that, then you may actually be making the two different slots at a perpendicular, which means your wheel axle will not be able to go through and connect to the wheel. So you want to make sure that you have that slit kind of lined up perfectly, so that later on when you're attaching the axle, you're able to, because if not, you're going to actually have to undo all of this and reattach the wheel properly. Another tip for these wheels for this model is that I would actually use an X-Acto knife to line up the tab openings right there, as you can see, because there is an inner wheel piece that's actually not connected by the frame of the wheel, and so it'll kind of be floating around. So using the X-Acto knives will make sure to align the holes, which means now that all the holes are aligned, you are able to put in the tab through and actually secure the wheel in place. This is another area where you're going to be actually opening up the opening that holds the wheel axle, and then you're going to be placing the axle in and then close off that tab again, so that the wheel axle will be secured in place, but it will actually be able to rotate freely. And this is kind of where I noticed that when I was rotating the wheel axle as a test, the main axle did not rotate, and so this is me actually taking it off and then making the cockpit inside out and then reattaching back to the body. So all the steps you saw before about attaching the body frame and the wheel axle and then the main axle, I had to redo, which is what you're seeing right now. But at the end of it, once I put the wheel axle in place and rotated the wheels to test it out, everything ran smoothly, and it actually was a really smooth gear change, or not gear change but rotation. So it was actually worth the effort, and I kind of wish I paid attention to what I was doing at the very beginning, just because it was kind of a pain to realize later on that the very first step was my mistake. This part was actually difficult for me just because my fingers are pretty stubby, and this is a really small part, and it's a two-part problem. One of them is so small that my fingers are having a hard time trying to grab the right area, and the other part is that since it's such a small piece, it is actually harder to bend the metal pieces because the sheet metal is thicker than your typical sheet model metals. And so what happened was I actually would sometimes use two different pliers to kind of leverage the two pieces or the piece together, so that it would bend 90 degrees. So that was a difficult area for the build. This was another area that was just really hard for me to do. When I'm connecting that front axle to the two wheels, it was hard to kind of get the wheels in place, put it through the hole, and then bring it in through the slot, and then also making sure that the piece would not rotate, because I actually kept having the piece wanting to fall forward, and so it's kind of hard to try to secure all that at the same time, especially trying to reach into the hard places and actually bending the axle so that the axle will stay in place. So overall, like, this is like an area that I did not enjoy just because the limitations of my fingers and how thick they are, and it's you know, I still actually do have pretty clumsy fingers, even though I like doing all this intricate work. But a lot of times it just takes me a lot more time just because it's harder to do more intricate work with my fingers. And always make sure to check everything with the manual. In this case, they actually show you how to bend the metal. The only problem with that diagram is that it is actually not a 1-to-1 scale. So what ends up happening is you have to kind of guesstimate the bend and the curvature a little bit, just because you can't align it exactly with that green line, because it is actually longer than your actual sheet metal piece that you have. this was one of the places where I actually had a hard time trying to adjust the tabs, just because my pliers actually had a thicker edge. And so this is before I bought my needle nose plier, and if I had the needle nose plier here, it would have been a simpler build, just because I'd be able to reach in some of these areas and actually go in between the two sheet metal pieces and actually be able to bend the tab. But in this case, I did have a little bit difficulty, but all I did was just kind of warp the sheet metal in between a little bit by wedging it, and then getting my plier in and then twisting it, and then I'll bend the sheet metal back into its original form. So as you can see, I'm testing it again along the way, and here I'm actually, this is the second gear that I'm creating right now. And one thing I did not realize is that there is a third gear, because I somehow missed that step on the manual, even though it is very clear about the third gear that I need to create. So I will be, as you can see, each gear that I put in, I will rotate the wheel just to make sure that the gears are in place properly and that it is rotating with each other. And that is how I was able to catch on that something was missing when I realized that one of the gears was not rotating with the wheel when I added the last wind-up coil, as the wind-up coil and the second gear was not being connected. So on my previous Time for Machine model build that I have a post of the video of, I made the mistake here of removing the plastic wrap around that coil, and the biggest problem with that is that the coil is wound up really tightly, and so once you undo that, the coil just flies away and it gets unwound, and after that it was a real pain to try to wind that coil back up into a smaller size to be able to fit into that cover. And so my suggestion is just to be really sure not to remove that plastic until it's necessary. And even when you do, it was difficult trying to remove the plastic, because as soon as you snip off that plastic piece, the coil will unwind and it will actually expand inside the cover itself, which creates little gap, or actually no gap at all, between the plastic piece, so that it was actually wedged in there and it was really hard to remove that plastic. So just be careful when you're working this part, because this is a little bit difficult build to do for this portion here. And what you're seeing right now is that after I closed off the cover and then I started putting all the gears on it, I realized that I was missing a piece inside, and it's a crucial piece because it's the piece that connects the coil to the actual axle of the gear that you're seeing right now. And so I had to actually open everything back up just to be able to put that one piece in, and it is something that you cannot forego. You need to have that piece, so always make sure to read the manual carefully, just because I knew that piece was there, and because I built a similar model before, and then it just totally blinked on me to check the manual for that one step, and I just totally forgot to put that piece in, and it caused me a lot of headache trying to undo a lot of things. And this is why I was calling this build a series of unfortunate events, or I guess a series of unfortunate mistakes, is that I made a few mistakes along the way, but luckily with this machine, with this model, it was actually very forgiving with these mistakes, because I was actually able to bend the pieces back into its original position to be able to take out a part, and then putting it back in and then bending it back into place. This would actually not be possible with a lot of the metal earth ones, or you'll have to be very careful when you're doing that, because a piece will probably snap, and then you'll have to end up using some super glue to glue it back into place, or contact metal earth and ask them for a replacement part. So this is one thing that I really did enjoy about the Time for Machine model. It's the forgivability of your mistakes. And although it looks like it didn't take too much effort to get the plastic out, this actually went on for about 15 to 20 minutes before I was able to get it out. And as you can see here, part of the coils came out, and I actually had to put it back into place. But what's difficult is, as I explained earlier, the coil gets unwound, so it's tight inside that space, and so the only way to get around it is to wind the coil all the way as much as you can, and this will hurt because you have no firm grip on the area that you need to wind it. And so what I had to do was actually grab onto the axle and wind up the coil, and then once it got small enough, I was able to push that end piece, the loop piece, back into place and make sure that it's snapped between the frame. There's like a cross bracing on the frame that you need to have it be overhooking so that the coil will not just keep rotating in place. So as I'm testing, I can see that it's not touching the coil at all, and this is when I realized something's wrong. And so as you can see, I'm actually adding the last piece here, and now I was just kind of rolling the car to see if all the gears worked, and it did, luckily, and so I was able to move on. I'm sure you noticed by now, but I'm actually wearing some nitrile gloves. And so when I first started off, I wasn't wearing actual gloves, and the reason why was just because I wanted to have a firm grip on things. And as I get near the end, and I was gonna have pieces where I would not be able to reach, or it will be an area that I know it will be visible, because a lot of times with the frame area, you will not actually see the frame, so I wasn't too concerned about leaving fingerprints. But now that I started working on the finish of the build, I wanted to make sure that I didn't really get my fingerprints on, and so I would be doing a lot of wiping down on the sheet metal with the fabric that came with the model, and also just making sure to wear my gloves as much as possible so that I'm actually reducing the amount of fingerprints that I'll have on this sheet metal. The seemingly simple task of attaching that piece was really difficult, because since it's ended perpendicular to the tab, but you have no real leverage to be able to bend the piece, and it is a small piece that is actually really difficult to bend. And so after struggling for about 5 minutes, I was finally able to get through the underside of the car and be able to bend the tab so that the piece will stay in place. And this is the connector piece that will connect your steering wheel to the front wheel axis. The rest of the build was actually pretty simple, except this one part here that I do want to talk about, which is the actual seat. So as you can see, I'm bending the seat here, but on the bottom side of the seat, you're going to see the two long pieces that are part of the seat. And you're going to notice that one has a bunch of steps on it and it's wide, and the other one is kind of narrow. And so you probably want to look at the opening that's going to be on the underside of the cockpit to see which side has a wide opening and which side has a narrow opening. And you want to make sure that you have your orientation for your seat, because I made the same mistake here where I was actually building the seat and I was being really careful about bending the sheet with the round edge to make sure that it looks very nice. And then when I tried to attach the piece to the frame, I realized that it was on backwards. The piece itself was inside out, and the way I knew was that I could not fit it in through the slot of the cockpit. And that's when I realized that the wide and the narrow was there for a reason. And so you have to make sure that you have the wide and the narrow on the correct side. So I actually had to undo all the bends and actually rotate it the other way, so I actually had to make it inside out. So as I finish up the model, I did want to just kind of give an overall review. There were certain areas in the manual that I wish they kind of brought to attention more. Like I said in the previous model for the timer for machine, the area where they tell you not to remove the coil was not as clear, and you kind of see it later on the step where it tells you to remove the coil, because the diagram itself will show you an unwound coil, so be careful of that. And I kind of do hope that Time for Machine does correct the mistake of not showing an unwound coil. But overall, I really enjoyed this build and really love the flexibility of making mistakes. As you can see, I made quite a few mistakes on this build, but the final product, you cannot tell any of those mistakes because you did not see any bent pieces or any score marks of areas where there used to be bends that I was not intending to do. The model works really well. The wind up works really well. As you can see earlier, that all the gears rotate in place. It looks really nice. You know, it has a very high quality sheet metal model feel to it, and it is actually a high quality premium model. And I was actually really excited to do this, and I hope to do more of the Time for Machine builds. And I just wanted to talk about, I actually like this video because I made the mistakes, because I wanted to show you guys that I'm not perfect. I do make a lot of mistakes, but a lot of times I will find a way to make it work or fix the problem. And so it's not about making the perfect model as much as learning from your mistakes. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you do, please subscribe or watch my other videos on this channel. Thank you.